Broadcasting from the commodity capital of the world, Zurich, Switzerland, this is Insider's Guide to Energy.
Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and with me is co-host Jeff McAulay. Jeff, welcome to the program.
Great to be here as always, Chris. Really excited for today's guest.
I am excited for our guest today. We have Michelle Davis, Head of Global Solar at Wood Mackenzie. Michelle, welcome to the program.
Hi, folks. Great to be here.
Michelle, we'd love to hear more about your background. You come from a real deep passion around industry analysis, not just in solar, but even before your current position. Tell us a little bit about your history and how you've come to research at the solar industry.
Sure. I oftentimes will joke with folks that my entire career has been in observing and researching the industry, yet I've never worked directly in the industry. But it's a fun place to be, and it's one that I feel particularly compelled to be in. So I started my sort of market research career at a competitor of Wood Mackenzie at IHS Markit. They had acquired a small energy firm. For maybe some of you that have been around a long time, you might know Emerging Energy Research. I was on that legacy team for a couple of years, very early in my career as a budding research analyst. And after a few years there, I then joined Wood Mackenzie, and I have been there ever since. And I started at Wood Mackenzie as a analyst focused on commercial solar. They hadn't really built out a lot of research on that particular segment, commercial being distinct from either residential or utility scale. So that's kind of where I cut my teeth. I'm now the head of all the global solar research around the world. This is a fairly new role to me, so I'm getting my legs under me. But I still have a very strong background in distributed solar in the United States, which I think is a very interesting segment. And I think it's been interesting to see that distributed solar is getting increasingly more attention. But I've been an industry analyst for going on, a little over a decade now, which is fun because basically everybody tells you sort of off the record what they're seeing and what they're hearing, and then you get to kind of compile all the different opinions, hear all the debates, and then bring some clarity and objectivity sometimes to some of those issues and some of those conversations. So I'm excited to kind of talk a little bit more about that today on the show.
Wonderful. And if people didn't know your name, they certainly know your work, because whenever anybody wants to quote stats on growth or magnitude of the solar market in the US, they're almost certainly referring to what is really the gold standard, which are these quarterly reports that you and your team put out at Wood Mackenzie, but are also distributed through SIA. So tell us a little bit about those quarterly reports. How did that come to be? And we'll get into some of what it says, actually, because it's always really exciting.
Yeah, sure. So the Solar Market Insight Report is sort of Wood Mackenzie's State of the Solar Industry Report. Many of you in the audience have probably read it or seen statistics from it, like Jeff was saying. We have had this reporting, this solar report around for a long time, way before my time, over a decade. So I can definitely not claim credit for establishing the report and its reputation. But I have shepherded it for several years. I've been the lead author since like 2020 or so. And it sort of serves as kind of the bread and butter of a lot of the subscriptions that we offer at Wood Mackenzie, because just kind of to start somewhere in a new market, a client needs to know, or someone in the industry needs to know, how much solar was installed in certain places or in certain segments. And the putting together the report every quarter is is fun. It's a lot a lot of the same thing every quarter, but we have tons of different data sources that we use to get this sort of like source of truth of how much solar's been installed, where pricing trends are going. And then, of course, we're constantly talking to folks in the industry about what the hottest topics are in that particular quarter, what the biggest challenges are. So the report does a great job of sort of giving a broad summary to the industry on where all of that stands every single quarter.
And there have been some pretty broad brush, but very high level numbers that have come out. I think you've talked about maybe 40% of generating capacity by 2050 coming from solar, maybe even higher than that. Are those long range forecasts also things that you put out, or is your work more focused on the quarterly and annual?
Yeah, good question. So the Solar Market Insight report that we put out every quarter is mostly just about the near-term five-year outlook. But Wood Mac has lots of longer-term outlooks for the entire solar industry all the way out to 2050. And the statistic that you just quoted, we had our Wood Mackenzie's Solar and Energy Storage conference in just a few weeks ago in San Francisco, and I was able to show some of that longer-term modeling and the place that solar has in our longer-term forecasts in the power sector more broadly. And when you take all of our different projections for different technologies across the entire power sector, we're predicting that by 2050, in the generation fleet in the United States, 40% of it will be made up by utility scale solar, which is pretty astounding and significant in my opinion. And sort of the point that I was trying to make in my presentation is that, in my view, that sort of means not that you'd want, not that one needs to pick or favor any technologies per se, but solar is, in my view, sort of if not the chief technology of the energy transition. If we're going to have 40% of generating capacity be utility scale solar by 2050, if our forecasts come to fruition.
So to get to 40% of our generating capacity, what kind of scale is that? Like in gigawatts or like how big is that? Just help me picture that.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. So today we have about 150 gigawatts of solar installed in the United States. And of course, a lot of the statistics we've been talking about so far on the podcast are just the US. The Solar Market Insight report is just focused on the US. In the next 5 years, we expect that will roughly triple. So we'll get up to, another 300-ish gigawatts just in the next 5 years. Sorry. That's going to obviously continue throughout the trajectory of our long-term power outlooks. And the sort of place that looks like in terms of numbers, to address your question, Chris, is that the most capacity that the solar industry has installed to date was a little over 24 gigawatts in 2021. That's the most the industry has ever installed, according to all of our data. Just within the next couple of years, because of all of these very strong drivers for solar and renewables more broadly, we're going to be regularly installing 40, 50 gigawatts of solar every single year in the United States. So just in the next couple of years, we will be installing more than we ever have every single year. And obviously, you can kind of like think about that continuing throughout that multi-decade trajectory, and that's how you get to 40% of generating capacity. Obviously, that number also includes a lot of things like other power plants retiring and other additions from other technologies, but we're sort of entering a new and fascinating phase in the growth of the solar industry.
And so in order to hit that kind of capacity, I mean, the world is growing solar too, right? So we're talking US and huge numbers.
Yeah.
And I think even the IRA put some or one of the recent legislation has things onshore, giving you some sort of tax advantage for PV made onshore. How much that capacity do you think will make within the United States? How much manufacturing of PVs or solar panels do you expect to be taking place onshore?
That is the question of the moment. um, just in the next 5 years, which is really sort of the only time frame that we can realistically think about these things, is the sort of blunt answer from my side is not much. In terms of the actual capacity that's installed in the United States, most of it is still going to be coming from overseas. And that's not to say that we're not going to see, we report on this in the most recent Solar Market Insight report. The IRA has instigated a substantial amount of announcements for new manufacturing capacity. The stat we quote is that there's currently 52 gigawatts worth of solar manufacturing announcements in the United States, or it will be 52 gigawatts by the end of our short-term outlook. About 16 gigawatts of that is currently under construction. It's very possible that not all of it will come online when it's promised, and it does take a while to ramp up production. And furthermore, domestic capacity of solar modules is going to mandate higher pricing from folks in the solar industry. So while there's tons of momentum, there's a lot of promise of a lot more US-based manufacturing in the for solar. The reality of it is that probably only a small share of the actual installations in the US will come from domestically made modules.
Michelle, this is great. And I'm tempted to ask a ton more questions getting into the numbers, but maybe it's worth taking a step back and reflecting where does the data come from to inform these projections? And it seems very well researched, of course. How well have your predictions or forecasts been in the past? And do you go through that exercise? I think maybe not everybody does.
Yeah, good question. The short answer to your question is yes, we do look at our forecasts and how they compare to the past. So much changes on the policy front that those comparisons are actually harder than you would think, because say we want to do a 5-year review of our past solar forecasts. Well, there's been like, I can literally think of 4 or 5 significant federal level massive state policy changes that would have caused our forecast to be totally moot anyway, not to mention any state forecast changes. So those comparisons can sometimes be kind of hard, but the short answer to or the kind of like short way that I tend to explain it to people is that when we do comparisons of our forecast to reality, in the near term, we tend to be within about 10 to 15% of what actually gets installed. That number increases in the longer term. So the longer term years, the error bar gets bigger. That's kind of the brief answer I tend to give folks. Going back to the data sourcing, our data comes from lots of different places, but and it kind of depends on what segment of the industry you're talking about and what part of the value chain. I'm the most familiar, of course, with our distributed solar data, since that's kind of where I've grown. And just to give you a flavor, we collect a ton of distributed solar interconnection data from dozens of utilities and different program administrators across the country. So we've established these relationships and have had them in place for sometimes over a decade, thanks to the original sort of SIA Green Tech Media Research Partnership. So these are real world project level data sets. And then in places where we don't have project level data, we'll supplement it with EIA data or something else to give us the total size of the market. On the utility scale side, I mean, we have analysts whose literal full-time job is to track every single project. So we have, a database with, the 5,000-ish utility scale solar projects in the US and all these details on them, plus all of the ones that are under construction and under development. So that's kind of, that's the ultimate source of the data, is a lot of these project level data sets that we have access to.
Great. And you mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, and that is one of the seismic regulatory shifts that we've had in the last 6 months or so. Are you now factoring that in? How much has that changed your forecast?
Yeah, we had incorporated the impacts from the IRA last fall. Um, we had actually been thinking about the impacts of the Build Back Better Act on our solar forecast originally, in as early as late 2021. And so we finally incorporated the impacts of the IRA into our forecast and published that officially last fall. And the statistic that I remember from the time is that it increased our projections by 40%. It was a significant driver of additional solar additions. Um, the main one of the main drivers, of course, is just that the tax credits that are so lucrative and so important have continued instead of expiring. So at that time, of course, the forecasts that we had assumed a lot of dropping off of solar additions once the ITC was starting to phase down. So once the IRA was passed, a big part of our forecast revisions were not having that decline anymore because the solar incentives or the ITC would continue. So yeah.
So people often say that data doesn't lie. So you've got a huge corpus of data that you're working with. What are some surprises, or what is something that you've come across that maybe industry members are overlooking, or wives' tale is it's not right, but the data is telling you a different story? Can you share an example of something like that?
Sure. Probably one of my favorite topics. Um, One of the first things that I can think of is we will sometimes have clients who will come to us and ask why our forecasts aren't higher, because they see massive pipelines, they see so much project development activity, they see tons of incentives like with the IRA, and they don't understand why our forecasts are what they are. And sort of in the spirit of respecting the data and the history, what I'll often tell them is in a typical solar project pipeline in a given state, only about 10 to 20% of that pipeline tends to get built. So uh, when you project that on a lot of the different sources of pipeline data that we have, either in utility scale or in distributed solar, our forecasts are a very good reflection of taking that pipeline and heavily discounting it. So I think that's kind of one surprise that I think a lot of people don't fully realize and appreciate about sort of the nature of this industry, is that there is just a lot of project development that doesn't end up coming to fruition. The second thing, which is kind of along the same lines, is that, and very related, is that there will be some state level targets, for example, that states will set out. The most recent example that I can think of this is that the federal government, some division within the DOE, has this big goal of 5 million community solar subscribers by 2025, which is only in 2 years. I forget what the gigawatt target is, but the main sort of headline is 5 million people subscribed. We've compared that to our current community solar outlooks, and the outlooks that we think are going to actually, the amount of capacity that's going to come to fruition in the next couple of years is a small fraction of that goal. So oftentimes we'll have people in the industry, stakeholders or clients, who will say, why are your projections not reaching these targets? And if there's not some sort of very concrete incentive for projects to get built in order to meet that incentive, then we don't necessarily have any reason to believe that our forecast is going to suddenly increase just to meet that target.
This is great to hear, and I want to emphasize you're coming at this from an analytical perspective, not an evangelical or, yes, we might be all enthusiasts of solar, but you're not coming in here to say it will go up because you want it to. You're saying it will go up because that's what the data tells you. And people might want it to be higher or want it to be lower, but that is irrelevant. You just present what the information tells you. And I think that's very hard to do in what is a very political industry. So
Yes.
kudos for that. I am a true energy nerd, so I need to ask some pretty nerdy questions to get it out of my system about units. So,
Sure.
and this is just, your preferred units of having this conversation. And by that, I mean, when we're talking about cost decline, do you think it's more important to talk about dollar per watt or LCOE, or is dollar per watt just what we use because it's convenient? And similarly, when we talk about market size, it's very easy to talk about capacity when energy production, which includes capacity factor, which would be a more normal way of comparing to other generation sources. So capacity and dollar per watt both being metrics of convenience maybe, but less accurate. Where do you fall on that debate to the extent it exists?
I can't say that I have a strong opinion about using particular metrics or not. I think all of those different things are useful. It does seem like not that we've touched on this in this conversation, but pure capacity numbers in terms of solar installations, I think, are becoming, so much capacity will get installed, but then in the way that we're currently installing solar today, that could just mean a lot of midday solar. But it's, you don't necessarily know what share of that capacity has storage attached. And therefore that capacity could be, utilized at other hours of the day. So that just the pure capacity figures for solar can be a little bit more misleading in terms of how useful that capacity is to the grid. And I think, we all understand that as more and more solar gets installed and we have more and more solar penetration, then that midday solar does become less and less useful. And then you start to get into conversations around capture price, like, what you actually capture in terms of pricing for a solar project and things like that, stuff that's a little bit more technical. LCOE, I think, is a perfectly useful metric along with cost per watt. Just kind of depends on the application. But I do know just from being an observer of energy Twitter that folks have very strong opinions about whether LCOE is a useful metric. But we do still report on it at Wood Mackenzie and calculate LCOE across all the different technologies.
All right, so you're not willing to upset half the energy Twitter followers and pick one. So you mentioned storage kind of ad hoc in your last answer. How is storage playing into this? You just gave some pretty big numbers of where solar's going to be. What's storage part of this?
Yeah, good question. Well, one hopes that storage is increasingly a part of the story that we can tell with solar. Thinking about utility scale first, I do know that within the pipeline of utility solar projects within the U.S., about half of them, I don't know the exact percentage off the top of my head, but about half the pipeline today does have storage attached, which I think is pretty promising. I don't know the like gigawatt to gigawatt hour ratio per se, but I think that's fairly indicative of where developers are moving, which I think is very promising. I still think that figure could be higher. And then because of some of the issues that we were just talking about with, increasingly more midday solar is going to mean that more solar on the grid gets less and less value. But the story on the distributed solar side is a little different. With regards to, residential and commercial solar, the attachment rates that we see concretely in our data are still, I think, a lot lower than folks kind of think about. A typical attachment rates today in most states are like 10% or less. So 10% or less of projects also install a battery. And it's even that tends to be a little higher for residential, like maybe 5 to 10%. In non-residential, it's even lower. Tends to be 5% or less. The one exception is Hawaii. Hawaii has way high attachment rates, so I don't want to leave Hawaii out. And that's because, if anyone in your industry is familiar with Hawaii, they have had way higher distributed solar penetration, really, than any other state market. And they've completely changed their compensation schemes and the way that they pay distributed solar projects to make it so that it's basically a dumb decision not to have a battery. So attachment rates in Hawaii are quite different. They tend to be 80 to 90%. But in the kind of continental US, attachment rates are still quite low. And in my view, that's sort of a bit of a missed opportunity, and one that I think I would like to see attachment rates accelerate faster in distributed solar.
So with that 10% or that small number of attachment rate, does that mean that the ratepayers then are basically becoming, paying more because they have to build capacity for baseload for all this project, since you're getting advantage of solar during the peak times, but then you still need capacity for non-peak times because there's no battery with the solar. So I'd imagine traditional generation would create that baseload. Is that possibly logical thinking or illogical thinking?
Well, I think for a little bit of background, I think to get at your question, when you have most people who have a solar and storage system today are not installing enough storage capacity to be able to power all of their consumption. The typical model is that you have one battery, which is not typically enough for a typical single family homeowner in the U.S. to cover their consumption during an outage. And what you utilize that battery for is for optimizing your energy pricing and when you pay for energy. So I have a battery. I live in Tempe, Arizona. Salt River Project is my utility, and the battery that my husband and I added helps us to keep our demand low during the on-peak demand window so that we don't have to pay high demand charges. So that's kind of the purpose of the battery. Whether or not that ends up paying off and saves you enough money in order to pay for the battery is very different depending on the rate schedule that you have, the area that you're in, how much you paid for the battery, et cetera, et cetera. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, it does. But like I said, I was just wondering that if you're doing commercial scale projects, right, to
Yep.
rate shave or do whatever you want to do with it, right, you're not really having enough battery capacity for downtime. So the grid still needs to produce that capacity, right? So you get cheap energy when it's cheap, but then somebody still needs to produce the other energy. So I was just wondering.
Yeah. Almost.
The infrastructure still needs to exist. You're not getting rid of the turbine plant because you're going to still need it at some point until we.
That's right.
A certain capacity of storage is what my premise was.
Yeah, that's right. The vast majority of solar plus storage installations today in distributed applications like residential and commercial, they still use power from the grid. I mean, at my house, the battery is pretty much depleted after that on-peak window, and then we charge our car at night. We're just charging our car from the grid at that point. So it would be probably very similar dynamics for a traditional commercial customer as well.
Of course, I'm going to ask about the EV since you opened the door. I realize we're getting a little bit
Sure.
off topic there, but can't resist. I mean, is there a future where there isn't stationary storage in addition to an EV, and the EV plays the role of the stationary storage?
I think there is a future like that. The world of the batteries in cars serving as a resource for the home or the grid, Vita, whatever you want to call it, is a lot more nascent than the residential or commercial storage markets are today. So I think, that future is possible and is probably coming, but I think it will be, if current trends that I've watched over my career prove anything, is that it will probably be further in the future than we'd like to think. I think most people today believe that solar plus storage is just kind of like the new normal, but if you think about those attachment rates that I quoted, it's clearly not. In some states, attachment rates are way up. I know we haven't touched on this yet, but a lot of folks in the industry know that California dramatically changed its net metering policy in the spring. And from the tidbits that we've heard from folks in the industry, that has caused their attachment rates to be dramatically higher than they were before. Because the way that the new net metering regime is structured, it's way more beneficial to have a battery. So more of that is definitely coming. So I would say there's probably going to be more momentum in that type of market development than people literally starting to make decisions about, well, I don't want a battery, I'm just going to buy an EV and use that instead. We're not there yet. That's a future that I think Sunrun wants to play out. But what's interesting, and I mentioned Sunrun just because they have one of the most publicly known partnerships with Ford for the F-150 Lightning, where Sunrun will install a charging station for the truck, in addition to having opportunities to sell solar or storage to the customer. But what's interesting is that Sunrun also pitches the battery. Even though the battery is a fraction of the size and backup power as the battery that's in the truck, they think that these things are synergistic, and that if you have a Ford F-150 Lightning and solar, you'd also want a battery, and that all of these technologies would be one comprehensive use case to utilize all of them together. So Sunrun, who I think is one of the more forward-thinking companies in the EV space and solar plus storage space right now, they're not thinking of it as an either or.
So as we're talking about all of these items, it's great from an energy perspective and a theoretical perspective, but I can imagine some of the listeners are starting to add up these costs, right? So let's talk a little bit about costs and maybe financing. So start us off from a dollar per watt basis on a residential system without storage. What's the trend at? I know that varies by state.
Sure. Yes, it does vary by state. So financing does add a little bit more to the cost of solar. We have, what we report on in our data is just like the cash price, and the and pricing has actually increased significantly in the last year and a half, 2 years or so. But I was just looking at our solar system costs a minute ago, and in 2022, for example, on a state-by-state basis, they basically run a little bit more than, say, $3 a watt for a typical residential system. It tends to be lower than that in certain key states, certain low-price states, and then it's lower than that, obviously, for certain types of commercial. But that's sort of the general range in our data.
That still seems high, actually. And we're hearing from folks in other countries that they're able to get residential systems at half that, obviously depending on the country. Do you see a lot of room for that $3 a watt to continue to fall, or is that going to have a tough time compressing?
Well, I think it will begin to, our projections is that solar costs are going to continue to fall, or start to fall and continue their former trajectory starting this year. The last couple of years of price increases have been an abnormal time for the solar industry. The solar industry is used to pretty consistent incremental cost declines. But solar supply chain constraints and COVID impacts and all of those things made it so that over the last couple of years we've seen prices increase a little bit. So yes, I definitely think that there is room for those prices to decline, and we are projecting that in our forecasts at Wood Mackenzie. I think a lot of it will depend on where financing goes in the United States. It's an interesting time right now for solar lending. Solar lending in the United States has been the dominant model for solar financing. And with interest rates going up, that has meant that the lenders have had to increase their pricing too. So depending on, we're predicting basically that residential solar installations are going to have a little bit of a tough year or two in this higher interest rate environment. But then additionally, another dynamic that's happening at the same time is that there's additional incentives in the IRA for third-party owned solar. So for solar leasing or power purchase agreements. Depending on how all of that shakes out and which financing models sort of win the day, that could affect how much people are paying for solar over the course of the next several years.
What impact is the current or the spot market for power or the ratepayers rate? How directly correlated is that to their install rate right now? Like, are there certain states where solar is just not popular because power is cheaper and the value isn't that great yet?
When power is cheaper, it absolutely makes residential solar a harder sell. The states where residential solar has sold the most is pretty directly correlated with states that have high power pricing. California is 40 to 50% of the distributed solar market for a reason. But I will say that that's starting to change a little bit. And as solar costs have come down, and especially in the last several years as loans have become very efficient and lenders have been able to improve more and more classes of customers and get lower cost of capital, that's made some of those moderate to lower priced states in terms of power pricing to be more accessible for things like residential solar. So I would say, that generally is the case, but it could be changing and more states will be accessible.
So as we're getting towards the end of our time, one of the challenges I think we talked about briefly, and I'm sure Jeff will jump in on, was interconnections and interconnects as a gate. So if you look at
Yeah, I was realizing we basically have only been talking about distributed solar, which is only a fraction of the solar industry in the US. So yes, please.
So maybe we should pivot a little bit and get what else is taking place and what are some of the hurdles and gates that we're trying to get through.
Yeah, the biggest challenge with interconnection right now in the United States is just that you talk to lots of folks and lots of stakeholders across the industry. What seems to be the case is honestly just that utilities and transmission, regional transmission organizations are understaffed. The amount of solar, wind, and storage interconnection requests has exponentially increased over the last decade. The investment that these organizations have put into engineers and analysts who can handle these interconnection requests has not. So it's just a bit of a resourcing and talent issue. If anyone out there in your audience is considering some career opportunities, you'd have no lack of them at a utility or an RTO. I know that lots of people in the industry also talk about process and how things could be reformed to be a lot more efficient, to think about the system a lot more holistically. Right now, we basically treat every project individually and do upgrades individually, which is obviously not a wholesale solution when we know what's happening on the grid as the energy transition continues. But the biggest thing to me just seems to be a lack of resourcing, and we'll just have to continue to invest in that as a country, and try to solve those issues as fast as we can in order to move these things forward.
We've covered a lot of ground, Michelle. So maybe as we wrap here, thinking about another area of challenge that we haven't discussed, and then maybe if you can close it with some areas of innovation where you're seeing there's opportunity for the industry to continue to grow.
Sure. I think to kind of close it on areas of innovation, I appreciate seeing any kind of technology or platforms that encourage interaction or transparent pricing signals between renewable energy projects and the broader grid. Obviously, this is, my distributed solar expertise is showing, because there's a lot more opportunity for this on the distributed side of the grid. But that distributed side of the grid is going to become increasingly important as transmission capacity fills up on the transmission side of the grid. So any kind of opportunities for projects, distributed solar projects, and hopefully increasingly distributed plus solar plus storage projects, to put power onto the grid at the right times of day and responding to the right kinds of price signals, I think that's one of the best opportunities for this industry, because one of the things that I don't want to have happen is, the more and more solar we install, obviously that means more and more carbon-free energy, but also at the same time, the more and more solar that we install also means that we're really sort of disrupting power market pricing and dynamics on the current system that we have in place. And the last thing that I think any of us would want in the energy transition is that as solar continues to grow, it becomes more and more of a disruptive technology that is viewed as causing all of this harm, not only for solar projects itself, but for the power grid overall. We want these projects to be viewed as contributing to the grid, contributing to the solutions, not causing more of the problems. So yeah, I think that's kind of where I'd like to see the opportunities.
Couldn't agree more. We'll have to tee up a transactive energy discussion in the future. But Michelle, really appreciate the time. We love reading your reports, looking forward to the next one. And it's been great getting to peel back a few layers with you on this discussion today. So thank you so much for joining us.
Of course, Jeff, you're very welcome.
And for our audience, we hope you've enjoyed this content as much as we have creating it. It's been a fantastic conversation. If you want to find out more about solar, tune into Insider's Guide to Energy. We got some great content that you can find. Follow us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, and we'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.